Three ghosts returned to Venice, smelling of rotting hide and ancient dust. These beggars, covered in filth and grease, claimed to be the dead Polo brothers. As the crowd recoiled in disgust from their stench, the strangers drew knives and began to rip their own clothes apart. What spilled from those stinking rags froze the laughter in every throat and turned mockery into cold, paralyzing fear. In the year 1295, three spectral figures drifted into the Venetian lagoon. They did not come as conquerors or as merchant princes laden with silk, but as remnants of a forgotten era. Their boat, scarred by salt and time, moved slowly through the crystalline waters that mirrored a city of marble and gold. To the eyes of the fishermen and dockworkers, these men were nothing more than derelict shadows cast against the shimmering glory of the Republic. They stood silent, their gazes fixed on the campaniles and domes they had not seen for more than 2 decades, looking like strangers in their own birthplace. The stench that preceded them was not the familiar salt of the Adriatic, but a thick, suffocating musk of the Far East. It was the smell of dry Mongolian steppes, of camel hide, and of fires fueled by the dung of wild beasts. People on the piers instinctively pulled back, covering their noses with silk handkerchiefs to shield themselves from the foul odor of these apparitions. The travelers wore tattered tunics made of coarse, matted felt, greased by years of sweat and grit from deserts that no Venetian map had ever dared to chart. They were walking testimonies to a wilderness that the civilized world had long ago relegated to the realm of nightmares. Their faces were masks of weathered leather, scorched by a sun that burned far more fiercely than the gentle light of Italy. Deep furrows, carved by the relentless winds of the Gobi and the biting frosts of the Pamir Mountains, ran across their brows like dry riverbeds. To the pious citizens of Venice, these visages were not human but resembled the terrifying countenances of pagan idols found in the dark corners of the world. Scars from skirmishes with bandits and the bite of unknown insects marked their exposed skin, telling a silent story of survival against odds that would have claimed the lives of 1,000 lesser men within a single moon. 24 years had passed since these men had vanished into the haze of the eastern horizon. In Venice, time had moved in cycles of trade, war, and political intrigue, but for the Polo family, they were names inscribed on tombstone markers in the hearts of their kin. They had been officially mourned and their estates settled, for no soul believed that a human could endure the terrors of the Silk Road for nearly a quarter of a century. The return of the dead was a theological impossibility that struck fear into the hearts of the superstitious, making the crowd wonder if these were indeed the same men or demons wearing the skins of the lost. As they stepped onto the stone quay, their gait was heavy and unfamiliar, the walk of men who had spent more time in the saddle than on solid ground. They spoke to one another in a tongue that sounded like the cracking of dry branches and the howling of wolves, a guttural dialect of the Mongols that no one in the harbor could comprehend. When they attempted to address the locals in their native Venetian, the words came out clumsy and rusted, buried under layers of foreign languages. Their souls had been rewritten by the vastness of the territories they had crossed, leaving only a hollow shell of their former Italian heritage. The news of their arrival rippled through the narrow alleys and over the arched bridges like a sudden, chilling wind. Word reached the great palazzos that 3 beggars claiming to be the long-lost Polos were wandering toward the San Giovanni Grisostomo district. Neighbors peered through heavy iron grates, whispering prayers and crossing themselves as the bedraggled trio approached their ancestral home. The contrast was jarring. The elegant Gothic architecture of Venice stood in silent judgment of these men who looked more like nomadic scavengers than the refined merchants who had departed so long ago in the service of their commercial greed. When they finally reached the gates of the Ca Polo, the servants refused them entry, threatening to set the dogs upon the ragged intruders. The current inhabitants of the house looked down from the balconies with a mixture of disgust and bewilderment, unable to see any resemblance to the portraits of the young, vibrant men who had left for the East. The 3 travelers stood in the dust of the street, their presence a living insult to the order of the city. They did not shout or plead, for they carried within them the quiet patience of the desert, a stillness that was perhaps the most unsettling thing about their entire demeanor to those watching from safety. Marco, now a man in his early 40s, looked at the walls of his home with eyes that had seen the Great Wall of China and the marble terraces of Xanadu. To him, the splendor of Venice seemed small, almost fragile, compared to the continental scale of the empire he had served. He remembered the silk tapestries and the silver plates of his youth, yet here he stood, a pariah in a coat of felt that smelled of horses and old grease. The memories of the Kublai Khan's court, where he had been a favored official, felt more real than the hostile faces of his own countrymen. He was a bridge between two worlds, but at this moment, the bridge was broken. The skepticism of the public grew into a chorus of mockery as more people gathered to witness the spectacle of the three liars. It was easier to believe that these were clever impostors seeking to claim a dead man's inheritance than to accept the reality of their survival. They were questioned by local magistrates who sought to catch them in a fabrication, yet the strangers remained stoic, their answers brief and strange. They spoke of cities where millions lived in harmony, of stones that burned like coal, and of a king who ruled over the entire world. Each detail deepened the conviction that these men were suffering from a profound and dangerous madness. The great hall of the Polo was bathed in the warm, flickering amber light of 300 beeswax candles, their flames dancing against the heavy silk tapestries that lined the walls. This was a space designed to showcase the prestige of a merchant dynasty, yet for 24 years it had felt like a mausoleum for a name that was slowly fading into the ledger of the dead. Now, the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, aged Malvasia wine, and the sharp, floral perfume of the Venetian elite. Every prominent family had sent a representative, not out of respect, but out of a morbid curiosity to see the return of the ghosts who claimed to be the heirs of this noble house. The guests reclined on velvet cushions, their fingers adorned with intricate gold rings and their necks draped in lace that had cost a small fortune in the markets of Flanders. They were the masters of the Mediterranean, men and women who believed that the world ended where the Venetian galleys stopped their patrol. Among them sat the three travelers, still wearing the hideous, grease-stained robes of the Mongol steppes that they had refused to cast aside upon their arrival. The contrast was a deliberate provocation, a visual insult to the polished elegance of the Republic's nobility. To the observers, the Polo men looked like beasts invited to a garden of lilies. As the servants moved between the tables with silver platters, the whispers among the guests grew into a low, buzzing roar of mockery. Snickering behind embroidered fans, the ladies of Venice pointed at the coarse, matted wool of Marco's sleeves, wondering aloud if he had forgotten the touch of silk during his long exile. The men exchanged knowing glances, fueled by the wine, mocking the strange, guttural cadence of the traveler's speech and the way they watched the room with the predatory stillness of desert hunters. To the refined ears of the assembly, the tales of the East were nothing more than the desperate hallucinations of failed merchants. The atmosphere of the banquet was one of a staged comedy, where the audience waited for the inevitable moment when the charade would collapse. Maffeo and Niccolò sat like statues of stone, their weathered hands resting heavily on the table, seemingly oblivious to the sneers that greeted their every movement. Marco, however, looked at the crowd with a profound, terrifying clarity that seemed to pierce through the vanity of the room. He did not see the wealth of Venice, he saw a small, provincial town compared to the vast, celestial cities he had left behind. His silence was not one of shame, but of a man who possessed a secret that would shatter their reality. Suddenly, at a prearranged signal that none of the guests observed, the three men rose from their seats with a synchronized grace that silenced the room. The music of the lutes and flutes died in an instant, leaving only the crackle of the hearth and the heavy breathing of the intoxicated guests. The Polos did not speak, nor did they offer any further explanations for their presence. Instead, they reached for the small, sharp knives used for carving meat, their blades catching the golden light of the candelabras. A collective gasp of alarm escaped the throats of the women, as some feared a sudden outburst of violence from these seemingly untamed barbarians. They did not turn the blades toward the guests, but instead began to methodically rip the thick, hidden seams of their tattered Mongol kaftans. The sound of tearing felt was sharp and rhythmic, like the steady pulse of a drum in the silence of the hall. With each deliberate stroke of the knife, the travelers dismantled the only garments they had worn since crossing the borders of the Christian world. The guests watched in a state of suspended disbelief, unable to comprehend why these men would destroy the very clothes that had protected them from the elements. It was a ritual of transformation, a peeling away of the mask they had presented to the city. As the first seam gave way near Marco's chest, a single, blood-red ruby tumbled from the lining and struck the white damask tablecloth with a heavy, resonant thud. It was followed immediately by another, and then a cascade of emeralds so vibrant they seemed to hold the essence of a sunlit forest within their facets. The methodical cutting continued, and from the shoulders, the sleeves, and the hems of the three men, a torrent of concentrated wealth began to pour forth. The table, which moments before had been covered in the remains of a feast, was now being buried under a rising tide of the world's most precious and rarest minerals. The sound of the gems hitting the wood was not the metallic clink of coins, but a dry, earthy rattle that suggested the weight of the earth itself. Large, uncut diamonds, transparent as the tears of a grieving goddess, rolled across the table to settle against the wine goblets. Deep, oceanic sapphires, the color of the midnight sky over the Indian Ocean, piled up in shimmering heaps. There were pearls the size of pigeon eggs, shimmering with a ghostly, iridescent luster that made the candles seem dim by comparison. The sheer volume of the treasure was staggering, defying any attempt at a quick mental calculation of its immense, world-changing value. The mockery that had filled the hall was extinguished as if by a sudden flood. The guests rose from their cushions, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a hunger that bordered on madness. They leaned over the table, the light of the gems reflecting in their pupils, turning their expressions into masks of pure, unadulterated greed. The very people who had whispered insults minutes ago were now trembling, their hands twitching with the urge to reach out and touch the impossible wealth. The air in the room became cold and thin, as the realization set in that these were not beggars, but men who carried the treasury of a continent in their rags. Niccolo Polo reached into a deep pocket near his waist and pulled out a handful of rubies that were so large they looked like the coals of a dying fire. He let them slip through his fingers, watching as they scattered among the emeralds and diamonds. There was no joy in his expression, only a grim, weary satisfaction. He had lived through the heat of the burning sands and the ice of the mountain passes to bring this weight home, and now he watched the elite of Venice grovel before it. This was the language they understood, the only truth that could bridge the gap between his experiences and their limited, sheltered, and unimaginative minds. The systematic deconstruction of the garments lasted for nearly an hour, during which time the pile of stones grew to a size that seemed physically impossible to have been concealed on 3 human bodies. It was as if the cloth itself had been a gateway to a hidden dimension of opulence. The travelers stood amidst the ruins of their old clothes, their undergarments stained with the dust of a dozen kingdoms, but their presence was now more commanding than that of any doge. They were no longer the 3 ghosts of the lagoon, they were the masters of a fortune that could buy the loyalty of kings and the silence of the church itself. A profound and unsettling shift occurred in the collective psyche of the room. The initial shock of seeing the wealth began to curdle into a darker emotion. The guests looked at the gems and then back at the scarred, sunburnt faces of the Polos, and for the first time, they felt a genuine chill of fear. If this was merely the surplus of the East, what kind of world existed beyond the sunrise? What kind of emperor could afford to gift such riches to mere messengers? The treasures were no longer just beautiful objects, they were evidence of a power so vast and so alien that it made the Republic of Venice seem like a tiny, insignificant sandbar in a vast, dark ocean. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the sound of a single ruby rolling off the edge of the table and hitting the stone floor with a sharp, final click. No one moved to pick it up. The greed that had momentarily flared in the hearts of the nobles was now being suppressed by an overwhelming sense of insignificance. They realized that the stories Marco had told, of cities with thousands of bridges and armies that numbered in the millions, might actually be true. The weight of that truth was more terrifying than any lie, for it meant that their world was not the center of the universe, but merely a distant, forgotten province. Marco Polo stepped forward, his boots crunching on a stray diamond, and looked directly at the most senior magistrate in the room. His eyes were not filled with the pride of a rich man, but with the haunting loneliness of someone who had seen too much. He didn't need to speak to convey his message, the piles of rubies and sapphires shouted it for him. This was the blood of an empire, the concentrated essence of a civilization that dwarfed anything Europe had ever conceived. The gems were not a gift to Venice, but a warning of how little the West truly knew about the scale of the world and the power of the great Khan who ruled the rising sun. As the night deepened, the guests began to retreat from the Polo, slipping away into the darkness of the canals like thieves caught in the light. They did not speak of the treasure as they rode home, the memory of the red rubies felt like an open wound in their minds. The fear of the unknown had taken root in the heart of the city, a cold realization that the world was far larger and more dangerous than they had ever dared to imagine. Behind them, in the silent hall, the 3 men remained with their mountain of stones, the only people in Venice who knew that this glittering hoard was not even a fraction of the wonders they had left behind. The legacy of that night would haunt the Republic for generations, turning the name of Polo into a symbol of both wonder and dread. While the stones would eventually be sold and scattered into the crown jewels of Europe, the memory of their reveal remained a scar on the Venetian soul. It was the moment when the medieval mind first collided with the overwhelming reality of the East, and found itself wanting. The Polos had returned not as heroes, but as harbingers of a new era that the world was not yet ready to accept, leaving the people to wonder if the gems were a blessing or a curse from a land that didn't care for their existence. As the seasons turned and the chill of winter gave way to the humid, salt-heavy breath of a Venetian spring, the initial shock of the jewels began to fade into a more comfortable and cynical familiarity. The stones were locked away in iron-bound chests, and the sapphires were traded for influence and galleys, but the men who had brought them remained a restless figure in the city of his birth. Marco did not settle into the quiet life of a wealthy, retired merchant as his father and uncle had. Instead, he frequented the piazzas and the sun-drenched docks, driven by a persistent and desperate need to explain the incomprehensible wonders he had witnessed during his long absence. He would stand in the shadows of the great stone arches of the Rialto, surrounded by merchants who prided themselves on their knowledge of the world's secrets. There, he spoke of things that sounded to the ears of a 14th-century European like the fever dreams of a man possessed. He told them of a substance he had seen in the northern provinces of Cathay, which he described as black stones dug from the veins of the mountains. He claimed that these stones, when set amidst a fire, would ignite and burn with a heat more intense and more enduring than any bundle of seasoned oak or pine. To the Venetians, whose lives revolved around the scarcity of timber, this was a physical impossibility. The listeners would exchange mocking glances, their faces twisting into grins of disbelief as they warmed their hands by the traditional hearths. They asked him how a rock, cold and lifeless, could possibly hold the spirit of fire within its heart. Marco described how these black stones could smolder through the entire night, providing warmth to the inhabitants of vast cities even in the biting grip of a Mongol winter. But to the men of the Republic, his words were nothing more than a distortion of nature. They laughed at the idea of a mountain of fuel that did not regrow like a forest, branding his account as the first of many clever but impossible lies. Even more offensive to the sensibilities of the Venetian merchant class was his description of the emperor's currency. Marco spoke of a world where gold and silver were not the primary means of trade, but were instead locked away in the great Khan's treasury. In their place, the emperor issued small sheets of paper, manufactured from the processed bark of mulberry trees. He explained with meticulous detail how these slips of parchment, stamped with the vermilion seal of the sovereign, carried the same weight and value as a solid gold florin. He described a society where a man could buy a palace or a herd of horses with nothing more than a handful of decorated bark. The merchants of the lagoon, who spent their days weighing coins and testing the purity of metal with touchstones, found this concept to be an affront to God and reason alike. They argued that value must have substance, that wealth must be something one could feel the weight of in a leather purse. To suggest that a ruler could simply decree that paper was gold was seen as a sign of either a tyrannical madness or, more likely, a gross exaggeration by a traveler seeking to impress his betters. They mocked the idea of a kingdom built on thin air and ink, failing to grasp the sophisticated machinery of the credit and command economy that fueled the East. Marco's descriptions of the urban landscape of China were equally staggering, pushing the limits of medieval imagination to the breaking point. He spoke of the celestial city of Quinsai, which he claimed possessed 12,000 stone bridges, each one wide enough for 10 horsemen to ride abreast. He described canals that were cleaner and more orderly than those of Venice, lined with palaces of marble and gardens that bloomed with flowers unknown to Western botany. To a Venetian, their own city was the pinnacle of human achievement, a jewel of the Adriatic. To hear that it was a mere village compared to the metropolises of the Khan was a blow to their collective pride. He would describe the great markets where tens of thousands of people gathered daily to trade silks, spices, and pearls, and where the air was filled with the scents of 1,000 exotic perfumes. He spoke of public baths that could accommodate hundreds of citizens at once, fed by pipes of warm water, a level of hygiene that was virtually inconceivable in the cramped and plague-shadowed streets of Europe. The more he described the scale of these cities, the more his audience retreated into a protective shell of irony. They began to count his bridges in their heads, adding them to a tally of falsehoods that grew larger with every conversation. The numbers he used to describe the Khan's power were what ultimately sealed his reputation as a fabricator. He did not speak of hundreds or thousands, but of millions. He claimed the Khan commanded an army of millions of horsemen, that his subjects numbered in the hundreds of millions, and that the revenue of a single province could surpass the entire wealth of the Roman Church. For the people of Venice, whose world was defined by small city-states and limited feudal levies, the concept of a million was an abstraction of infinity. It was a word used by poets and madmen, not by sober merchants who dealt in the tangible reality of the present. It was during these months of storytelling that the name Messer Million, Master Million, was born in the taverns and shipyards. What began as a whisper behind his back soon became a public title, shouted across the canals as a greeting that dripped with sarcasm. He became a living caricature, a figure of fun for the bored nobility who invited him to their feasts not to learn about the world, but to be entertained by his grandiose claims. They treated him like a court jester who told tales of people with the heads of dogs or men who lived on the scent of roses, even though Marco's own accounts were remarkably free of such mythological monsters. The irony was that while the public craved stories of sea serpents and winged demons, Marco gave them reports on tax systems, postal routes, and agricultural innovations. He described the Khan's messenger service, where 10,000 way stations were maintained across the empire so that news could travel at the speed of a galloping horse. He spoke of a world that was organized, efficient, and technologically superior to their own. This was the true offense. The people of Venice could have forgiven stories of dragons, but they could not forgive a reality that made their own civilization appear stagnant and primitive in comparison. Marco found himself increasingly isolated within the very city he had struggled so hard to reach. He would sit by the windows of his home, looking out at the gondolas and the grey water, feeling the weight of a truth that no one wanted to carry. The frustration was visible in the tightening of his jaw and the weary look in his eyes whenever a guest asked him, with a smirk, to tell the story of the golden roofs of Xanadu once more. He realized that the gems he had brought were a double-edged sword. They proved his success as a merchant, but they also made people believe that his mind had been warped by the glitter of too much gold. The children of the neighborhood would follow him through the narrow calle, tugging at his cloak and begging for a million more stories of the great Khan's elephants. For them, he was a wizard from a storybook. For the adults, he was a cautionary tale about the dangers of staying too long in the company of pagans. His life became a theater of the absurd, where every factual observation about the geography of Asia was treated as a punchline to a joke he hadn't told. He was trapped in a prison of his own memories, surrounded by people who shared his language but lived in a completely different mental universe. The psychological toll of this widespread disbelief manifested in a quiet, simmering anger. Marco did not retract his statements, nor did he attempt to soften the numbers to make them more palatable to the Venetian ego. If anything, he became more adamant, his voice growing sharper as he defended the existence of the great river Yangtze, which he claimed was so wide it appeared like a sea. He watched as his neighbors crossed themselves when he spoke of the Khan's religious tolerance, where Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists lived under a single law. Such a notion was seen as a heresy that only a man who had lost his soul in the desert could propagate. As the months stretched into years, the legend of the Millionaire of Lies became a permanent fixture of Venetian folklore. Marco Polo was no longer a man, he was a symptom of the era's anxieties about what lay beyond the familiar borders of the Mediterranean. The more the world expanded through his words, the more the people of Venice tried to shrink it back down to a size they could control. They clung to their maps that showed Jerusalem at the center of a flat earth, and they laughed at the men who told them that the earth was vast, diverse, and indifferent to the decrees of the Pope or the ambitions of the Doge. Even within his own family, the atmosphere was one of strained tolerance. His relatives enjoyed the comforts that his Eastern wealth provided, but they remained silent when the mockery grew loud in the public squares. They were merchants first, and a tarnished reputation was a liability in the world of commerce. Marco's insistence on the truth of his experiences was seen as a personal eccentricity, a burden they had to bear in exchange for the rubies and silks. He was a stranger at his own table, a man who had seen the sun rise over the edge of the world and could never again find comfort in the shadows of the familiar. Yet, despite the laughter and the derision, the seeds of change were being planted. In the quiet libraries of monasteries and the private studies of a few enlightened scholars, his words were being transcribed and debated. While the masses laughed at Messer Milione, the first cracks were appearing in the medieval wall of ignorance. Marco's stories were acting like the very coal he described, smoldering slowly, unnoticed by the crowd, but possessing a heat that would eventually ignite the fires of the age of discovery. For now, however, he remained a man alone, a prisoner of a reality that his peers were simply too small to inhabit. In the year 1298, the azure waters of the Adriatic were churned into a crimson froth during the catastrophic Battle of Curzola. Marco, who had once navigated the sophisticated courts of the East, now found himself commanding a Venetian galley against the rising naval supremacy of Genoa. The air was thick with the stench of burning pitch and the screams of the dying, a violent contrast to the silent deserts of his youth. When the Venetian line finally shattered under the Genoese assault, Marco was dragged from the splintered remains of his vessel, his wealth and history offering no protection against the heavy iron chains of his captors. He was transported to the city of Genoa and cast into the lightless bowels of a stone fortress, a place where the passage of time was marked only by the shifting of shadows and the damp chill of the Mediterranean winter. The walls of the cell were weeping with stagnant moisture, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of grime that seemed to absorb any warmth. It was in this suffocating confinement that the vast, golden horizons of the Mongol Empire began to ignite once more within his memory. While his physical form was trapped in a few square paces of cold granite, his mind was wandering across the endless grasslands of the Great Khan's northern territories. Among the shadows of the prison, destiny provided him with a companion whose skills would transform Marco's memories into a tangible legacy. Rustic Hello of Pisa, a man whose life had been spent crafting chivalric romances and tales of King Arthur, sat in the same gloom, his spirit hungry for a new story. He possessed the rare ability to weave raw observation into the rhythmic prose of the era, and he saw in the weary Venetian a source of wonder unlike any he had encountered in his books. As the two men huddled together for warmth, a pact was formed. Marco would provide the truth of the world, and Rustic Hello would provide the ink and the structure to preserve it. The process of dictation was a slow and rhythmic ritual that stood in defiance of their miserable surroundings. By the flickering light of a single, guttering tallow candle, Marco would speak of cities that glittered like constellations and rivers that flowed for thousands of miles. Rusticello's quill scratched incessantly across the parchment, capturing descriptions of creatures and customs that sounded like pure sorcery to his Italian ears. The sound of the pen was the only rebellion they had against the silence of the state, a desperate attempt to bridge the gap between their narrow cell and the continental expanse of the territories they were describing in such vivid detail. Marco described the palace of the Great Khan at Xanadu, a structure of marble and gilt that sat within a park enclosed by 16 miles of walls. He spoke of the emperor's hunting parties, where 10,000 white horses were kept solely for the production of sacred milk and where tame lions were used to track the swiftest deer. As Rustic Hello wrote these words, he struggled to contain his own skepticism, often embellishing the descriptions with the flowery language of knightly legends to make them more palatable. In the damp dark of a Genoese prison, the boundaries between the empirical report of a traveler and the imaginative flourish of a romantic poet began to blur. While the feudal lords of Europe were engaged in petty squabbles over tiny strips of muddy land and crumbling fortresses, Marco was dictating the logistics of a civilization that governed millions. He described the YAM, the imperial postal system that utilized hundreds of thousands of horses and relay stations to transmit messages across the width of Asia in a matter of days. To the prisoners and guards who overheard these accounts, the idea of such an organized and far-reaching authority was a joke. They could not conceive of a world where a single man's decree could be heard and obeyed across mountains that took months for a caravan to cross. The Venetian spoke of the island of Cipangu, the land of the rising sun, where he claimed the palaces were roofed with solid gold and the floors were paved with the same precious metal 2 fingers thick. He recounted the failed Mongol invasions of the east, describing storms of divine origin that shattered the Khan's armadas against the rocky shores of a hidden kingdom. These chapters of the book, filled with the glitter of unimaginable wealth and the tragedy of lost fleets, were the ones that fascinated Rustic Hello the most. Yet, it was precisely these accounts of golden islands that would later lead the world to believe the entire work was a fabrication. In the gloom of the dungeon, Marco also detailed the strange and terrifying technologies he had witnessed, such as the use of naphtha and early forms of gunpowder in siege warfare. He described how the Khan's engineers could divert rivers and level mountains to bring a city to its knees, a level of mechanical sophistication that was centuries ahead of anything the Genoese or Venetians possessed. The guards would listen to these stories with a mixture of fear and derision, crossing themselves as if Marco were describing the machinery of hell itself. For them, it was easier to believe that he was a servant of the devil than to accept that a pagan emperor was more advanced. The manuscript grew thicker with each passing week, a heavy stack of parchment that became the most valuable object in the cell. Marco insisted on including the exact measurements of trade, the varieties of spices, and the specific taxes levied on salt and silk in every province. He wanted his book to be a guide for future merchants, a map of the possible, but Rustic Hello was more interested in the sensational. This tension between the merchant's cold facts and the writer's thirst for the marvelous created a text that was both a scientific breakthrough and a piece of high entertainment, a hybrid that would confuse and irritate scholars for generations to come. As the book began to circulate even before their release, rumors of its contents reached the courts of kings and the libraries of great monasteries. The response was almost universal. It was treated as a collection of fables, a medieval bestiary of a world that did not exist. Because Marco did not mention the Great Wall, an omission that would haunt his credibility for centuries, critics claimed he had never even set foot in China. They ignored his accurate descriptions of the Grand Canal and the coal mines, focusing instead on his failure to mention the drinking of tea or the binding of women's feet, using these gaps as evidence that his entire story was a mirage. Marco became a hostage to his own truth, trapped in a paradox where the more detail he provided, the less he was believed. He sat in his cell, listening to the laughter of his fellow inmates as they mockingly called out for more stories of the million. He realized that the world preferred the comfort of its own ignorance over the challenge of his discoveries. The book, which he had hoped would be a beacon of enlightenment, was instead becoming a source of ridicule, a literary curiosity that people read for the same reason they watched a jester or a dancing bear. His frustration was a silent, simmering fire that burned hotter than the Genoese sun. Accusations of heresy began to emerge from the religious orders, who found his descriptions of the Khan's religious tolerance to be an affront to the exclusivity of the church. To suggest that a pagan could be a just and noble ruler, or that Nestorian Christians and Muslims could live in peace under a Mongol law, was seen as a dangerous subversion of the divine order. The monks who copied the manuscript often added their own marginal notes, questioning the morality of a man who praised the virtues of the heathens. Marco's book was not just being read as a lie, it was being scrutinized as a spiritual threat to the foundations of the Western world. In 1299, a peace treaty was signed between the two warring republics, and Marco was finally released from his long captivity. He walked out into the light of the Genoese docks with the manuscript clutched tightly under his arm, his body thinner and his hair turned to ash, but his spirit remained unyielding. He returned to Venice not as a hero, but as the author of a scandal. The book was spreading across Europe, translated into dozens of dialects and languages, but it was being sold under titles that suggested it was a work of fiction. He had given the world the key to the East, but the world chose to treat it as a toy. The tragedy of the Genoese period was that it fixed Marco's image in the public consciousness as a man of words rather than a man of action. To his neighbors in Venice, the fact that he had spent his time in prison writing stories only confirmed their suspicion that he was a fantasist who had lost his grip on reality. They did not see the meticulous observations of a diplomat, they saw the desperate scribblings of a captive trying to find meaning in his confinement. The book was a mirror that reflected the limitations of the European mind, showing a society that was too small, too frightened, and too arrogant to believe in a world larger than itself. As the years passed, the original manuscript was lost, replaced by hundreds of copies that each contained the errors and biases of their respective scribes. Marco watched as his life's work was twisted and turned into a mockery, with illustrators adding pictures of monsters and cannibals to pages that had originally described the complex administration of a silver treasury. He became the most famous man in the world for a story that no one believed was true, a pioneer whose footsteps were erased by the laughter of his contemporaries. He had survived the crossing of the world only to be buried under a mountain of ink and the cold, unmoving weight of a continent's disbelief. Time, like the relentless silt of the Venetian lagoon, had slowly buried the vibrant youth of the traveler beneath layers of gray hair and brittle bone. In the year 1320, Marco Polo moved through the corridors of his ancestral home not as a conquering hero of commerce, but as a ghost haunting his own legacy. His skin, once bronzed by the fierce sun of the Gobi, was now as pale and translucent as the parchment upon which his controversial chronicles were written. The vigorous stride that had carried him across the roof of the world was replaced by a hesitant, dragging step that echoed through the silent, cold halls of the Polo. He often sat by the heavy oak windows, staring out at the gray, churning waters of the canal, his mind drifting far beyond the horizon of the Adriatic. In those moments of stillness, the sounds of the Venetian marketplace faded, replaced by the rhythmic thrum of thousand-hoofed Mongol cavalries and the high, haunting calls of the desert wind. He was a man divided, his physical form tethered to the damp stones of Italy while his spirit remained a permanent resident of the court of the great Khan. To his neighbors, he was merely an eccentric relic, but to himself, he was the only witness to a grandeur that the West was too frightened to even imagine. Within the intimate walls of his domestic life, the burden of his reputation was most acutely felt. His wife, Donata, a woman of practical Venetian stock, watched him with a mixture of dutiful affection and a deep-seated, unspoken weariness. She had spent decades managing the wealth he brought back, yet she remained a stranger to the men who had earned it. When he spoke of the silk-clad empresses and the perfumed gardens of the East, her eyes would often cloud with a polite, masking skepticism. She treated his memories as if they were a chronic fever, a lingering ailment from his youth that she had learned to tolerate but could never truly believe in or understand. His daughters, Fantina, Belila, and Morita, had grown up in the long, distorting shadow of their father's fame. They were the children of a myth, their very names associated with them and the city called Master Million. While they respected the authority he held within the household, there were times during the long winter evenings when a shared glance between them revealed the depth of their doubt. They had heard his stories 1,000 times, and to them, the tales of golden palaces and paper money felt like the nursery fables of a grandfather who had forgotten where reality ended. They loved the man, but they feared the ridicule that his persistent, stubborn truths brought. This domestic isolation was mirrored by the increasing pressure from the Venetian religious authorities. As Marco entered the twilight of his life, the church began to take a more aggressive interest in the state of his soul. Local priests, cloaked in the somber black and brown of their orders, became frequent visitors to the Polo. They did not come to hear of the geography of Asia, but to urge the old man to prepare for his final judgment. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones about the sin of pride and the spiritual danger of bearing false witness. To them, his book was not a travelogue but a ledger of vanities that needed to be purged before he met his Creator. These men of God were particularly disturbed by his accounts of the Great Khan's religious policies and the existence of vast, pagan empires that flourished without the guidance of the Pope. They viewed his descriptions of paper currency not as a marvel of administration, but as a devil-inspired trick designed to undermine the divine value of honest metal. In the eyes of the clergy, Marco had been seduced by the opulence of the heathens, his mind poisoned by the glittering illusions of a world that stood in defiance of Christian doctrine. They begged him to recant his fables so that he might enter the kingdom of heaven with a conscience cleared of worldly fabrications. Despite the mounting pressure, Marco remained as unyielding as the mountains he had once crossed. He listened to their sermons with a weary, stoic patience, his scarred hands resting heavily on the arms of his chair. He knew that the gold in his coffers was real, just as the memories of the Khan's favor were real, yet he was forced to inhabit a world where his experiences were treated as a theatrical performance. He was the Millionaire of Lies, a title that had moved from a sarcastic joke to a permanent social brand. Every time he walked to the Piazza San Marco, the whispers followed him, a constant, buzzing reminder that his truth was considered a deception. The social elite of Venice continued to invite him to their banquets, though the nature of the invitations had changed. He was no longer a merchant peer to be consulted on trade routes, but a curious specimen to be exhibited for the amusement of guests. They would ply him with wine and then ask, with thin, mocking smiles, for him to describe once more the city of 12,000 bridges. They wanted to hear the impossible, to laugh at the absurdity of a world that didn't fit within their maps. Marco played the role they demanded, his voice steady even as his heart grew cold with the realization that he was a puppet in a carnival of the narrow-minded and the blind. He found some small solace in the presence of his faithful Tatar servant, a man he had brought back from the East who remained the only living link to his true life. They would often sit together in the courtyard, speaking in the guttural, rhythmic language of the steppes that no one else in the house could understand. In those quiet exchanges, Marco was no longer Messer Millione, he was a traveler, a diplomat, and a man who had seen the sun rise over the Pacific. The servant's presence was a silent validation of his reality, a piece of the East that had not been corrupted by the cynical atmosphere of the lagoon, providing a sanctuary of memory in a city of doubt. As his health began to fail, the calls for a public retraction grew louder. His friends, concerned for the family's reputation and his own posthumous standing, joined the chorus of the skeptics. They argued that he had already achieved everything a man could want: wealth, a stable home, and a legacy for his daughters. Why, they asked, did he persist in clinging to these extravagant claims that everyone knew were impossible? They suggested that he could simply say he had exaggerated for the sake of the story, a common enough practice among travelers. But to Marco, to deny his words would be to deny the very essence of the 24 years that had defined his existence. He watched the scribes and the scholars who occasionally came to consult his book, noticing how they skipped over his detailed reports on commerce to focus on the more sensational passages. It pained him to see his work being turned into a manual for dreamers and poets rather than a guide for the explorers he hoped would follow in his wake. He realized that he had failed to translate the scale of the East into the language of the West. The gap between the two civilizations was not just a matter of miles, but a vast, unbridgeable chasm of the spirit. He was a man standing on one side of a canyon, shouting into a wind that carried his voice away before it could be heard. The physical world around him seemed to shrink as his infirmity increased. The grand halls of the Polo felt more like a prison than the Genoese cell of his middle age. He spent hours looking at his collection of Eastern curiosities, the silk robes, the strange weapons, and the jade ornaments, which were the only tangible evidence of his journey. To him, they were sacred relics, but to his daughters, they were merely exotic decorations, soon to be appraised and sold once he was gone. He felt the impending erasure of his life, the terrifying possibility that his truth would die with him, leaving only the caricature of the great liar to survive in history. Even the changing politics of the Mediterranean seemed to mock his past. The Mongol Empire he had served was beginning to fracture, the great Pax Mongolica that had allowed him to travel in safety was dissolving into chaos and civil war. The routes he had mapped were being swallowed by the desert and the rise of new, hostile powers. It was as if the East itself was retreating from the world, pulling back the veil and leaving Marco as the last man to have seen what lay behind it. The isolation he felt was not just social or familial, it was historical. He was the last witness to an era of global connection that was rapidly vanishing into the dark mists of time. One evening, while his daughter Fantina was reading to him by the fire, he interrupted her to ask if she truly believed the stories he had told her when she was a child. The silence that followed was long and heavy, filled only with the crackling of the wood in the hearth. When she finally looked up, her expression was one of profound sadness rather than conviction. She told him that she believed in his courage and his love, but that the world he described was too strange to be real. It was a moment of absolute clarity for the old traveler. If his own flesh and blood could not accept his truth, then the rest of the world had no chance of ever understanding. He began to retreat into a profound, inner silence, speaking less and less as the winter of 1323 approached. The fire in his eyes, once so bright with the reflection of distant fires, was now dimmed by a weary resignation. He stopped trying to convince the visitors and the priests, meeting their inquiries with a cryptic, knowing smile. He had realized that truth is not something that can be proven to those who are determined to remain in the dark. His legacy was no longer in his hands, it belonged to the future, to a generation that would have the courage to sail beyond the edge of the map and find the golden roofs for themselves. Despite his silence, the shadow of his myth continued to grow. In the taverns of Venice, the stories of Messer Milione were told with even more embellishment, turning him into a folkloric figure whose exploits surpassed those of the ancient heroes. He became a cautionary tale of what happens to a man who wanders too far from the bells of St. Mark's. To the city, he was already dead, a monument to the dangers of the imagination. But in the quiet room where he lay, surrounded by the scent of old silk and the dust of forgotten roads, the old man waited for the final voyage, the only journey that would require no maps and no explanations to the eyes of the blind. He spent his final weeks organizing his will, meticulously dividing the wealth that everyone acknowledged but whose origin they still questioned. He made sure his Tatar servant was provided for and that his daughters received their fair share of the rubies and sapphires that had once poured from his ragged clothes. This final act of administration was his last bridge to the reality of his city, a way to ensure that even if his stories were forgotten, his family would thrive on the fruits of his labor. He was preparing to leave behind the world of commerce and the world of lies, ready to step into the ultimate silence of the great and terrible beyond. He remembered the great Khan's face, a visage of absolute power that had once seemed more permanent than the stars themselves. He recalled the specific way the light hit the yellow tiles of the Forbidden City and the taste of the fermented mare's milk in the tents of the north. These sensory details were more vivid to him than the faces of the priests who hovered over his bed. He clutched a small piece of silk in his trembling hand, the fabric a silent testament to a civilization that produced wonders while Europe was still mired in the dark. The silk was real, the texture was real, and his memory was the only vessel left to carry the heavy weight of the truth. The pressure to repent reached its zenith as the new year dawned. The city's patriarch himself sent a message, hinting that a public confession of his exaggerations would be seen as a great act of humility and would secure his place in the annals of the Republic as a reformed soul. The elite waited for the moment when the great liar would finally break, when the weight of eternity would force the truth from his lips. They prepared their pens and their parchment, ready to record the admission that would restore the comfortable boundaries of their small, safe world. But the old man simply watched the dust motes dancing in the winter sun, his secrets locked behind a wall of dignity. He felt the immense weight of the miles he had traveled, a distance that could not be measured in leagues alone but in the profound transformation of his soul. Every mountain pass and every desert storm had etched a map into his very being, a geography of experience that was invisible to those who had never left the safety of the lagoon. He was a survivor of a world that was already becoming a legend, a living bridge that was slowly crumbling into the sea of time. His heart beat with the rhythm of 1,000 caravans, a steady, ancient pulse that defied the ticking clocks of the Venetian clockmakers who sought to quantify his life with their mechanical gears. In his final hours of consciousness, he saw the faces of the people he had known in the East, the officials, the merchants, and the nomadic warriors who had shown him more kindness than his own kin. He realized that his true home was not the stone palace in Venice, but the open road and the vast, indifferent plains of the Mongol Empire. The mockery of the world no longer had the power to sting him, for he was already halfway across the ultimate border, moving toward a horizon where there were no skeptics and no lies. He took a final, deep breath, the air smelling of the salt of the sea but tasting, for one fleeting second, like the fine, golden dust of the Silk Road. As the shadows deepened in the room, the flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shapes against the walls, making it seem as if the great Khan himself was standing guard at his bedside. Marco's eyes remained fixed on a point far beyond the ceiling, a celestial destination that required no guidance from the maps of the church. He was ready to join the millions he had spoken of, to become a part of the vast, unseen history that the West chose to ignore. The silence in the room became absolute, a profound and heavy stillness that marked the end of an era and the beginning of a mystery that would fascinate and frustrate the world for centuries to come. The icy breath of January 1324 had settled over the canals of Venice, turning the water into a dark, viscous mirror that reflected the leaden sky. Inside the chambers of the Polo, the air was thick with the suffocating scent of medicinal herbs, melted tallow, and the cold, damp stone of a city built upon the mud. On a heavy bed draped in fading silks, the man who had seen the sun rise over the farthest edge of the world lay trapped in the frail, trembling cage of his own body. His breathing was a ragged, shallow sound, a final rhythm that signaled the approaching end of a journey that had spanned half a century and thousands of leagues. Around the bed gathered those who had lived in the shadow of his legend, their faces illuminated by the flickering, uncertain light of the oil lamps. His wife and daughters stood in the corners, their expressions a mixture of genuine grief and the heavy, lingering burden of public shame. They were joined by the men of the church and the legal witnesses of the Republic, who had come not only to witness the end of a life, but to participate in a final, desperate attempt to reclaim the truth. For them, the dying man was a vessel of pride that needed to be emptied before it shattered, a soul that could only be saved if it finally confessed to the grand deception of its youth. The priest, a man of stern countenance and unyielding faith, leaned closer to the traveler, his shadow looming large against the tapestries of the wall. He held a crucifix in one hand and a parchment in the other, his quill ready to record the words that the city had waited decades to hear. He spoke of the eternal fires of purgatory and the weight of bearing false witness against the order of the world. To the cleric, the stories of paper money and burning stones were not mere exaggerations, but dangerous heresies that defied the divine hierarchy of nature. He demanded that the old man purge his soul of these fabrications so that he might die in the grace of the Holy Mother Church. The tension in the room was a tangible weight, pressing down on the observers as they waited for the collapse of the myth. The friends of the family whispered in the shadows, hoping that Marco would finally grant them the relief of a lie. They wanted him to admit that the golden roofs were a dream and the millions of subjects were a feverish invention, so that they could once again walk the streets of Venice without the stinging laughter of their peers. They were tired of being the kin of the great liar, and they saw this final hour as a chance to rewrite the history of their name. They watched the dying man's lips, praying for a sign of surrender to the common sense of the age. Marco Polo, however, seemed to be drifting in a place where the voices of the priests could not reach him. In the gathering darkness of his mind, he was no longer a withered merchant in a cold Italian palace, but a young emissary riding through the crystalline air of the northern plains. He could feel the heat of the Mongolian sun on his back and hear the distant, melodic chime of the bells on the emperor's silver-clad elephants. The faces of the people in the room were mere shadows compared to the vibrant, searing memory of the court at Kanbalik, where the majesty of human civilization had been revealed to him in its most terrifying and magnificent scale. His eyes, which had remained closed for hours, suddenly flickered open with a startling, lucid intensity that silenced the room. For a brief second, the reflection of the golden lamps in his pupils seemed to mimic the fires of the distant east, a flash of the celestial light he had brought back in his heart. He looked at the priest, then at the scribe, and finally at the fearful faces of his own children. He saw their smallness, their terror of the vastness he had described, and their desperate need for the world to be simple and contained. He realized that they were not asking for the truth, but for a comfortable illusion that would protect them from the overwhelming reality of the unknown. With a final, Herculean effort that seemed to drain the last reserves of his vitality, the old traveler forced his voice to emerge from the dry, cracked depths of his throat. He did not offer the confession they craved, nor did he apologize for the wonders he had witnessed. Instead, he declared with a firmness that vibrated through the silent chamber that he had not told the world even half of the things he had seen with his own eyes. It was not a boast, but a heavy, tragic admission of the limitations of language and the narrowness of the human mind. He was telling them that the reality of the world was even more impossible than the fables they had rejected as lies. The proclamation struck the room like a thunderclap, leaving the priest frozen and the scribes with pens poised over empty parchment. There was no repentance, no retraction, and no relief for the citizens of Venice. By refusing to deny his experiences, Marco had left them permanently haunted by a truth they could neither understand nor ignore. He had chosen to carry the weight of his integrity into the grave, leaving the world to grapple with the possibility that their small, sheltered lives were merely a fragment of a much larger, more complex existence. The anger of the witnesses flared in the silence, for they felt cheated of the closure that only a confession of guilt could provide. As the final breath left his body, the light in his eyes vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind the cold, empty shell of the man the world had called the Millionaire of Lies. He died in the early hours of the morning, while the frost still clung to the stones of the Polo, passing away into a history that would treat him as a fool for centuries to come. The city buried him with the standard rites of a merchant, but the air of mockery remained, a persistent stain on his memory that would be passed down through generations of skeptics who preferred the safety of their maps to the danger of his discoveries. In the weeks and months that followed his death, the anger of the Venetian elite only deepened as they realized that the book of his travels would now remain uncorrected for all eternity. They continued to use his name as a synonym for deception, and his daughters were forced to defend his estate against those who claimed it was the product of a life of fraud. The city of Venice, which prided itself on its worldly knowledge, turned its back on the greatest gift it had ever been given, choosing to live in the comfortable darkness of its own prejudices. The traveler had offered them the world, but they had chosen to remain on their small, familiar sandbar in the lagoon. Yet, as the centuries rolled forward like the tides of the great oceans Marco had once crossed, the shadows began to retreat from the maps of the world. Other men, driven by the same restless curiosity and fueled by the very book that Venice had mocked, began to sail into the unknown. Christopher Columbus would carry a copy of Marco's journals across the Atlantic, his margins filled with frantic, hopeful notes that sought the very golden roofs the old men had died defending. One by one, the incredible claims of the 14th century were revealed as the cold, hard facts of geography, as explorers found the burning stones, the paper money, and the celestial cities of the East. The historical irony was complete when the modern world looked back and discovered that every detail Marco had described, from the complex postal systems to the scale of the Chinese empires, was entirely accurate. The revelation was not just a victory for the traveler, but a profound indictment of the human spirit's tendency to fear what it cannot conceive. For hundreds of years, humanity had lived in a state of self-imposed ignorance, dismissing the truth as a fairy tale simply because it challenged their sense of importance. Marco Polo was not the liar, the world was the deceiver, lying to itself about its own insignificance in the face of the planet's true grandeur. The final emotional legacy of his story is one of a lingering, haunting anger at the waste of centuries. We are forced to realize that the progress of civilization was delayed not by a lack of information, but by a lack of courage to believe in the existence of the neighbor's greatness. Marco's final words on his deathbed remain a chilling reminder of how much of our own reality we choose to ignore because it is inconvenient to our beliefs. He died as a prisoner of his own truth, a man who saw the light and was punished for it by those who preferred the shadows. The fear he inspired in his contemporaries is the same fear that continues to govern the boundaries of our own curiosity. The image of the dying old man, refusing to gift his city the easy lie they demanded, stands as one of the most defiant acts in the history of exploration. It was a final, silent victory over the provincialism of the medieval mind. He left the world with a mystery that was actually a mirror, reflecting the limits of our own imagination back at us. Even today, the name Marco Polo evokes a sense of wonder that is inextricably linked to the pain of being misunderstood. He remains the patron saint of the misunderstood, a witness to a world that was too big for the people he loved, and a reminder that the truth is often far more incredible than any fiction we could invent. In the end, the story of the Millionaire of Lies is the story of the darkness we choose to inhabit. We see the anger of the priest and the frustration of the Venetian nobles not as distant historical emotions, but as the same resistance we feel today when faced with a reality that dwarfs our understanding. Marco Polo's ghost still wanders the corridors of our collective memory, his eyes still burning with the reflection of the Khan's fires, challenging us to look beyond our own borders. He died in January 1324, but his refusal to recant ensured that his journey would never truly end, and that the world would eventually have to wake up and face the dawn he had seen so long ago.